In this video, I'll be giving you my thoughts on the new 50mm f1.4 autofocus lens from Brightin Star. Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'll be offering you my review of the first autofocus lens from the company whose boxes I love oh so much, the Brightin Star 50mm f1.4. Now I've been testing this for the Fujifilm X mount, but I do believe it's available for Sony E and Nikon Z as well. Now, full disclosure, before we get into this, Brightin Star did send this lens over for testing and review, but they don't get to see this video before it goes live or have any input on it at all. All thoughts and opinions here are my own and have been formed over using this lens for the past couple of months. Now, by the end of this review, I may or may not get provided with another lens from Brightin Star in the future, so let's dig into it and see what this lens is all about. As with the 35mm f0.95 lens that I tested from Brightin Star, the build quality here is really good. While it's not weather sealed or made using any sort of exotic materials to keep the weight down, it is engineered really well and feels very solid in the hand. It's all metal and glass, just like the 35mm I tested. Now in fact, it's actually quite heavy for an APS-C prime lens, weighing in at around 450 grams, or almost the same as the XF56mm f1.2 RWR. Looking at the lens physically, and considering the size of the rear element, I wonder if this lens may have been designed with full-frame sensors in mind for the future. It looks and feels much like a 50mm f1.4 for a larger sensor. Now, the manual focus ring here is quite tight, and it makes it a bit difficult to make large changes, but very easy to be precise with. Now, it's probably a good thing given the shallow depth of field that's possible with this lens. Brightin Star includes front and rear caps, as well as a locking lens hood in the box. Now, the rear cap, as we've come to expect from a lot of third-party manufacturers, doesn't hold on to a lot of other lenses very well, and is best replaced with a Fujifilm one if you're planning on having other lenses in your bag to switch between. Now, the lens hood is of the type that I would really love to see used more often on the X-mount lenses. It's the locking type where you need to press a button to release it from the lens, just like the ones that Fujifilm uses on the GF lens hoods. Now, that means that it stays in place and it can't be accidentally knocked off when you're out in the field. But it only locks when it's mounted in the forwards direction. When it's reversed for storage, I've noticed that it just tends to fall off in my bag quite a bit, and I would really love to see that upgraded on future lenses. Brightin Star has, thankfully, kept their style points with this lens as well by including the black lens mount and the orange lettering on the barrel. At this price point though, and we'll get to that, I would hope for an aperture ring and perhaps some basic weather resistance, even if that's just a gasket on the lens mount. Autofocus is relatively fast and silent thanks to the use of a stepping motor in the lens. It interfaces with Fujifilm's entire autofocus system, so you get access to all of those AI focusing modes like eye detect and animal detect for whatever that's worth in a Fujifilm camera at this point. Now, while I was initially testing the lens, I noticed that it would misfocus quite frequently, and I reached out to Brightin Star to see if they had an updated firmware for it, and they pointed me to a new firmware that improved things quite a bit. But I still feel like there's still a lot of headroom for them to improve their autofocus accuracy with this lens. I still get a few misses in almost every batch of images that I shoot with this lens, but I found that it does have a much higher hit rate with close focusing distances rather than focusing on things further away. Now, of course, being a stepping motor, tracking is also quite good, and I haven't found any issues there at all. The center of the image is quite sharp wide open, and it gets better by f2. It continues to improve all the way down to f5.6, where it finds its sharpest point. Now, it's not on the level of the XF50mm f2 or the XF56mm f1.2 RWR, but the center sharpness should be good enough for many applications. The corners, however, are a different story. They're a bit of a soft mess at f1.4 and slowly get better till around f4, where I'd say they're acceptable. They never really get sharp, but they're quite good from that point onwards. Pin lights, especially around the corners of the frame, don't sharpen up until f2.8, so if that's a concern, it's best to stop the lens down to avoid coma and astigmatism. Flare and ghosting can be quite intense with this lens and don't really result in anything interesting most of the time. I've found myself shielding the lens with my hand more often than not, just to avoid these shortcomings in the lens design. Now, When direct sunlight hits the lens at odd angles, as you can see here, the image just gets taken over by flare and ghosting. But even with soft light, such as the light coming in the window at this cafe here, required me to shield the lens to retain contrast and prevent flare. On the odd occasion though, light can hit the lens at just the right angle, and if you're open to making use of these spiky rainbows and the blob of light in the frame, there are definitely some interesting images to be made. As I said though, they can be quite intense, and most images can make do without this sort of flare and ghosting, and it just ends up sort of taking over the image and making the image more about that flare and ghosting than the actual subject matter. Bokeh is overall quite nice with this lens. I found it to be soft and low contrast and non-distracting in all the images that I've made with this lens, and this is quite a contrast from the character-filled bokeh that I found with the 35mm f/0.95 from Brightin Star. There's a little cat's eyeing to be found towards the corners, giving a slight swirl to the bokeh, but nothing too significant. There's also a very small amount of chromatic aberration to be seen when the light is a bit harsh in the background, but again, nothing significant and nothing that you'd notice in day-to-day use. At night, it can get a little bit interesting when there are quite a few different lights around, but again, it's nothing too wild and I'm not against the look that it provides at all. But please do stick around for the slideshow at the end of the video to see some more examples of the bokeh. Wide open, the lens produces an almost two-stop vignette towards the corners, which clears up almost entirely by f4. At that point, the frame is fairly evenly illuminated. Now, I see the vignette wide open as being one of the strengths of this lens. Since the center is the only part that's really sharp wide open, and the corners get a little bit soft and dark, you can really easily encourage your viewer to look at a central subject. This lens is capable of rendering sunstars, especially when stopped down to f5.6 or f8. They render as soft and subtle stars that really don't take over the image, and the only thing that you need to watch out for when trying to create these is the flare and ghosting that we talked about earlier. In my time with this lens, I've mostly been able to use it as sort of a general purpose walk-around lens in between client shoots at this super busy time of year. But that's been a really good way to use this lens because I've been able to, use it in quite a variety of light and quite a variety of different situations, different times of day, that sort of thing, to really get a sense of how the lens operates without specifically having to test it. Now, its size and weight do mean that it's a little bit more comfortable when used on a larger body like the X-H2S than it is, for example, on the little X-T50 body. Now, on smaller cameras, you'll definitely be holding onto the lens while you walk around rather than the camera itself. Now, after testing some very small and light lenses recently, this one definitely feels like a tank when carrying it around for an hour or so. Not being able to fully trust the autofocus on this lens has been a little bit of a downer. I found myself having to take several images of each scene just to make sure that I get one that's in focus so that I don't have to constantly be chimping and zooming in to check that I'm in focus with every single frame that I take. And this has been especially true when testing on the X-T50 with its tiny little EVF that makes it very, very difficult to check precise focus. Now, I've been shooting a lot more than I normally would just to be safe with this lens, and even in the simplest of light, I found that the lens tends to struggle from time to time, which is a little bit disappointing, and I hope that Brightin Star can address this in some upcoming firmware updates. Otherwise, I've noticed that the images coming out of this lens tend to have a little bit of a lower contrast feel to them than Fujifilm's lenses, which gives them a bit of a nostalgic feeling. And at times I almost feel like I'm working with my old Nikon 50mm f1.4 AFD, albeit with sort of slightly better chromatic aberration correction and a sharper central area. The images have a soft feeling to them, especially in the out of focus areas, that can really create a much less clinical image than a lot of Fujifilm's lenses do, especially that new series of linear motor primes from Fujifilm. Now, during the time that I've had this lens, I haven't found myself really reaching to it for anything specific other than that soft feeling. It does a really good job in a lot of areas and produces decent images. Overall, Brightin Star have produced another solid feeling lens with quite good technical image quality. Sharpness is very good in the center of the frame, and once stopped down, it's not awful in the corners. Bokeh is quite nice, and fringing is really well controlled. Now, flare and ghosting are some things that you do need to be careful of, and the autofocus could benefit from some firmware work in my experience. So what's the catch with this? Well, in and of itself, this is quite a good lens, and in a world where it existed alone, I'd recommend it as a great option. but I promised in the beginning that we'd get to the price of this lens. Now, at $299, it's not an overly expensive lens, but when we consider the competition around it, there are some really aggressively priced comparable options. Now, things like the Meiki 55mm f1.4 or the Viltrox 56mm f1.7 spring to mind immediately. Now, granted, these are slightly longer focal lengths, but for many people, they'll fill the same role in their photography. The Meiki is smaller and has quite good bokeh. The Viltrox is tiny and light, but produces significantly rougher bokeh than this lens does. Now, Fujifilm's native XF lenses are all priced significantly higher than this lens, but a second-hand XF 50mm f2 could be a good option as well, with its weather-sealed design and its tiny and light build. Now, while this is a good lens, I definitely think it would be prudent to consider what about it is unique enough that it wins out over the cheaper competition for your photography. Now, from my perspective, I find it hard to recommend in the place of the plethora of 56mm lenses that are available for significantly less money than this. So, I hope this review has been useful to you, but do let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. For now, enjoy the slideshow, and I'll see you in the next video.